The funniest joke in the neighborhood lasted exactly 11 minutes. The first thing I heard wasn't thunder. It was laughter. Loud, confident laughter bouncing across soaked driveways while cold rain drummed against the concrete flood wall my grandfather had poured with his own hands more than 40 years ago. The smell of wet cedar, fresh mud, and river water filled the air before dawn had fully broken, but the members of the Ashbrook Ridge HOA didn't seem to notice. They stood beneath matching umbrellas, phones raised high, recording videos as if they were attending some neighborhood festival instead of watching a storm roll toward us. Melissa Grant, our HOA president, tapped the gray concrete with the heel of her expensive boot and laughed so hard the people around her joined in without thinking. "Look at this ridiculous bunker," she said. "I've seen prettier retaining walls behind grocery stores." Someone else added that my property looked more like a prison than a home. Another neighbor joked that I probably expected Noah's Ark to dock in my backyard. Every laugh echoed through the damp morning air, while rainwater trickled down the grooves of the wall they insisted was nothing more than an oversized eyesore. I stayed on my side of the property line with my hands tucked inside my rain jacket, listening to the steady hum of water moving through the drainage channel below. That sound mattered more than anything Melissa was saying. Water always tells the truth if you know how to listen. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 41 years old, and I design flood protection systems for a living. Most people think that means I spend my days staring at blueprints inside an office. The reality is a lot muddier. I've walked riverbanks after hurricanes, inspected washed-out bridges, and stood ankle-deep in floodwater trying to figure out why one neighborhood survived while another disappeared beneath 3 feet of water. That's exactly why, 3 years earlier, I invested nearly everything I had to restore the flood wall surrounding the lowest edge of my family's land. Every permit was approved. Every inspection passed. Every inch followed county engineering standards. None of that mattered to Melissa. According to the HOA, my wall lowered property values because buyers preferred open views of the river. They mailed violation notices. They fined me for the appearance of reinforced concrete. They demanded landscaping that would have blocked critical drainage paths. When I refused, they called me paranoid. This morning they wanted witnesses. Melissa smiled into a phone camera and pointed directly at me. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "this is what fear looks like. Thousands of dollars wasted because one man thinks he's smarter than nature." The crowd laughed again. I looked past them toward the river instead. The current had changed color overnight, turning from dark green to thick brown as upstream runoff accelerated toward town. I could smell churned earth riding the wind. The rain intensified, striking jackets, rooftops, and umbrellas with a sharper rhythm. My weather monitor chirped once from the porch behind me. Then again, nobody else seemed to hear it. They were too busy laughing at the wall. They never realized the only thing standing between that river and their front doors was the concrete barrier they had spent months trying to force me to tear down. 18 months before that storm, none of those people had cared what stood along the edge of my property. Back then the river was quiet. The grass reached my boots every spring, and the only visitors were deer wandering through the cottonwoods before sunrise. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, bought this land in 1978 after spending 20 years working highway construction across 3 states. He believed 2 things could never be negotiated with: gravity and water. Every Saturday morning he walked the creek with a worn measuring stick tucked beneath one arm and a dented coffee thermos in the other. As a kid, I thought he was simply checking on the fish. Years later, he smiled and told me the fish were checking on him. He showed me water stains left high on old oak trunks from floods that happened decades before I was born. He pointed toward the valley below and said that every generation eventually forgets what the river remembers. Those words stayed with me longer than any lesson I learned in engineering school. After college, I joined a civil engineering firm specializing in flood mitigation across the Midwest. My job took me everywhere from small farming towns to growing suburbs where new neighborhoods were built faster than anyone studied drainage maps. Again and again, I watched expensive homes suffer damage because someone ignored an old creek, removed a drainage ditch, or dismissed a floodplain as outdated history. Every disaster looked different, yet every investigation ended with the same sentence. The warning signs had always been there. When my grandfather passed away, he left the property to me with one handwritten note folded inside the deed. It read, "Take care of the wall. and it will take care of everyone else. At first I thought he meant preserving family history. Then I hired surveyors, reviewed county archives, and discovered his original design had been remarkably ahead of its time. The concrete barrier followed natural contours instead of fighting them. Hidden drainage channels relieved pressure before it could build. Overflow paths directed excess water safely toward protected wetlands instead of neighboring foundations. I spent nearly 2 years restoring every section using modern engineering standards while keeping his original layout intact. Every permit came through the county without objection. Inspectors signed every report. Emergency management officials even complimented the upgrades during a routine site visit. Then Ashbrook Ridge expanded. New houses appeared across the valley where open pasture had once soaked up heavy rain. Perfect green lawns replaced native grasses. Decorative stone entrances replaced drainage swales. Walking trails crossed areas that older topographic maps clearly labeled seasonal overflow channels. I quietly wondered whether anyone besides me had ever bothered reading those maps. Apparently not. Melissa Grant arrived shortly after the last construction phase finished. She sold luxury homes for a living and talked about curb appeal the way my grandfather talked about river currents. Every conversation somehow circled back to property values. She admired clean sight lines, matching fences, and magazine-worthy landscaping. My flood wall interrupted the view from several back patios overlooking the river, and that made it her newest obsession. She never asked why it existed. She only asked how quickly it could disappear. Standing there in the rain that morning, listening to her mock something built long before she ever moved into the neighborhood, I realized she had mistaken quiet preparation for unnecessary fear. Nature has a habit of correcting that misunderstanding all by itself. Melissa Grant never raised her voice unless she already believed she had won. That was her style. Calm smile, perfect posture, expensive raincoat that somehow never seemed to wrinkle. She spoke with the polished confidence of someone who had spent years convincing people to sign contracts they had not planned to sign that morning. The first certified letter arrived less than 2 weeks after she became president of the Ashbrook Ridge Homeowners Association. According to the notice, my flood wall created an architectural inconsistency with the visual identity of the neighborhood. I actually laughed when I read those words because my property had existed decades before the subdivision was ever built. Still, I answered respectfully. I attached engineering reports, county permits, inspection records, and photographs showing the restoration process. I assumed facts would settle the issue. Instead, Melissa sent another letter. Then another. Each one sounded more official than the last. The fine started at $100 a week, then doubled after the board voted that I had failed to comply with community improvement requests. During the monthly meetings, she displayed enlarged photographs of my property on a projector while discussing neighborhood beautification. My flood wall appeared on the screen beside flower beds, decorative fences, and approved mailbox designs as if critical flood infrastructure belonged in the same conversation as paint colors. Some neighbors looked uncomfortable, but nobody wanted to challenge the board. Nobody wanted to become the next target. One Saturday morning, I walked outside carrying a cup of coffee and found 3 bright orange violation notices taped across my front gate. The adhesive left sticky residue on the old cedar even after I peeled them away. The smell of wet paper mixed with fresh pine from the surrounding woods while I stood there reading accusations that my property projected fear instead of harmony. Fear. That word stayed with me all day. Melissa repeated it constantly. She claimed my wall frightened potential home buyers because it suggested flooding was possible. According to her, removing it would improve confidence throughout the neighborhood. I wondered how confidence planned to stop rising water. The harassment slowly spread beyond paperwork. My mailbox filled with anonymous notes suggesting I should move somewhere less dramatic. Social media posts appeared showing cropped photographs that made the wall look taller than it actually was. One caption read, "Ashbrook Ridge does not need private fortresses." Another joked that I must be preparing for the end of the world. Melissa even hired a professional photographer to capture panoramic images of the subdivision for promotional brochures, carefully positioning every shot so my property appeared as an ugly gray scar along an otherwise perfect landscape. The strange part was that none of those pictures included the river itself. It was almost as if pretending the water did not exist somehow made it less real. I attended every board meeting without raising my voice. I answered questions politely. I explained drainage elevations, overflow capacity, and historical flood records. Melissa listened with a patient smile that never reached her eyes. Then she thanked me for my comments before announcing another vote. Every motion passed unanimously. Every fine remained in place. As I drove home after one particularly frustrating meeting, windshield wipers pushing steady rain across the glass, I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me whenever people ignored common sense. He would say that rivers do not argue. They simply arrive exactly where the land tells them to go. Looking back, I realized Melissa thought she was fighting a stubborn homeowner. She never understood she was arguing. With decades of engineering, geography, and history, and none of those ever cared about public opinion. By the beginning of spring, I stopped trying to convince anyone that the wall belonged there. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every letter from the Homeowners Association went into a binder. Every email was backed up twice. Every inspection report, survey, permit, maintenance receipt, and engineering drawing sat neatly organized inside labeled folders in my office. Years of engineering had taught me one lesson that applied just as well outside construction sites. People forget conversations. Paperwork remembers everything. Melissa, however, mistook my silence for surrender. The violation notices became more creative. One accused me of allowing unauthorized industrial features to dominate the neighborhood landscape. Another claimed my drainage channel created unnecessary anxiety among residents. My personal favorite suggested the sound of flowing water reduced the peaceful character of the community. I stood beside that channel one afternoon after reading the notice, listening to water slipping quietly over smooth concrete with birds singing in the cottonwoods above me, and wondered what kind of peace required pretending rivers did not exist. Then came the contractors. I arrived home one Thursday afternoon to find 2 pickup trucks parked outside my gate. 3 men wearing reflective safety vests stood beside the flood wall studying printed drawings. One of them politely introduced himself and explained that the Homeowners Association had requested a demolition estimate for removing what they described as an obsolete concrete obstruction. I asked whether they had verified ownership before preparing a proposal. The foreman paused, looked at the county parcel map on his clipboard, frowned, and quietly admitted they had not. 5 minutes later, they packed their equipment and drove away without touching a single bolt. I never blamed the contractors. They had simply been handed incomplete information. Melissa called that evening before sunset. Her voice carried the same polished confidence it always did, but I noticed a trace of impatience underneath. She insisted the board had authority to require aesthetic improvements for the benefit of the community. I calmly reminded her that county property records defined exactly where that authority ended. There was a brief silence before she thanked me for my opinion and ended the call. 2 days later, another certified letter arrived anyway. Around that same time, I began noticing something else. Construction crews were still finishing the final phase of homes downhill from my property. Fresh sod covered yards that had been bare dirt only weeks earlier. Decorative stone planters replaced shallow drainage ditches shown on older development plans. Several storm inlets appeared partially blocked by landscaping fabric and newly planted shrubs. None of those details seemed dramatic on their own, but together they caught my attention the way a loose bolt catches the attention of an experienced mechanic. During one evening walk, I climbed the small ridge overlooking the subdivision. Cool air carried the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with damp clay after a brief shower. I watched rainwater collect where it should have continued flowing downhill. Small puddles lingered longer than they should have. Tiny changes in elevation redirected water toward streets instead of open ground. Most people would never notice. Engineers notice because water never improvises. It follows whatever path people unknowingly create for it. That night, I opened historical topographic maps beside current satellite images on my computer. Hour after hour, I compared contours, drainage routes, and grading plans while rain tapped softly against the windows. By midnight, one uncomfortable truth had become impossible to ignore. The wall was never the problem. The neighborhood around it had quietly changed in ways almost nobody understood, and the next major storm would reveal every shortcut that had been buried beneath fresh landscaping and attractive curb appeal. The Weather Service issued the first flood watch 3 days before the storm reached us. Most people treated it like background noise. Around here, Weather alerts showed up on phones often enough that they blended into everyday life. Melissa certainly acted that way. The very next afternoon, she organized a neighborhood barbecue beside the community clubhouse overlooking the river. Bright tints appeared across the lawn. Music drifted through the warm air, while the smell of grilled burgers and charcoal floated over freshly mowed grass. Children played catch. Realtors greeted prospective buyers with polished smiles. Melissa walked from group to group, assuring everyone that Ashbrook Ridge was one of the safest investments in the county. As I drove past on my way home from the county records office, I noticed something that made me slow almost to a stop. Decorative flower beds had been expanded around several storm drains near the clubhouse. Thick mulch covered the grates so completely that only narrow openings remained visible. A landscaping crew was still spreading soil less than 20 feet away. I parked along the shoulder, stepped out, and introduced myself to the foreman. He explained that the Homeowners Association wanted cleaner curb appeal before an open house event scheduled for the weekend. He showed me the approved landscaping sketch. The drainage structures were barely mentioned. Nobody seemed concerned that they had reduced the capacity of the very system designed to carry runoff away from the neighborhood. I thanked him for his time and continued home with a knot growing steadily in my stomach. That evening, I opened rainfall projections from the National Weather Service beside county elevation maps and my own engineering models. Every new forecast shifted in the wrong direction. The projected rainfall totals climbed from 4 inches to 6, then 8 in isolated areas. I ran the calculations again, hoping I had entered something incorrectly. The numbers stayed exactly the same. If enough debris reached those partially blocked drains while the river rose, runoff would begin collecting inside the subdivision long before the flood wall ever experienced serious pressure. The wall would perform exactly as designed. Everything surrounding it worried me far more. Early the next morning, I sent detailed emails to the county engineering office, emergency management, and the Homeowners Association board. I attached photographs, drainage diagrams, and simple recommendations. Clear the storm drains. Remove excess mulch. Open the overflow swales. Inspect the downstream culverts before the storm arrived. The county engineer replied within an hour, thanking me and confirming they would review the information. Melissa answered much faster. Her response contained only 3 short sentences. She wrote that the board had already consulted qualified professionals, that my repeated warnings were creating unnecessary concern among residents, and that future communications should be directed through the association attorney. I read those words twice while rain tapped softly against my kitchen window. Then I saved the email beside every other document in my growing folder. By sunset, the clouds had thickened into one unbroken gray ceiling stretching across the valley. The wind carried the unmistakable scent of saturated earth from miles upstream. My weather monitor chirped more frequently now, each alert sounding a little closer together than the last. Across the neighborhood, lights glowed warmly behind large picture windows while families settled in for another ordinary evening. I doubted anyone realized the countdown had already begun. Water never checks meeting schedules, never reads neighborhood newsletters, and never changes direction because someone voted against reality. Rain arrived just after midnight with the steady rhythm only a slow-moving storm can produce. It was not dramatic at first. No lightning splitting the sky, no roaring wind. Just countless drops striking rooftops, tree leaves, and the smooth concrete surface of the flood wall until the entire valley seemed wrapped inside one continuous sound. I stepped onto my back porch before sunrise with a flashlight in one hand and a steaming mug of black coffee in the other. The cool air smelled of soaked earth and fresh river mud drifting downstream. My weather station displayed rainfall totals climbing faster than they had the night before. The river gauge upstream updated every 15 minutes, and each new reading confirmed exactly what my calculations had predicted. The watershed was filling. I followed my normal inspection routine, checking expansion joints, drainage outlets, and relief channels one by one. Water flowed exactly where it was supposed to. Overflow ports remained clear. Pressure relief drains discharged steadily into the protected channel beyond my property. The wall was doing precisely what my grandfather designed it to do decades earlier. By 7 o'clock that morning, County Emergency Management issued a flash flood warning for low-lying areas. My phone vibrated twice within a minute as automated alerts appeared across the screen. I noticed another message almost immediately afterward. Melissa had posted a live video from the neighborhood entrance. She stood beneath a bright umbrella smiling into the camera while several board members laughed behind her. She joked that all the frightening weather predictions had finally given me the exciting flood I had been waiting for. Then she slowly turned the camera toward my property in the distance, zooming in on the gray line of concrete running beside the river. She called it the most expensive decoration in the county. Thousands of people would eventually watch that recording, but none of us knew that yet. I slipped my phone back into my jacket and continued checking equipment instead of replying. There was nothing left to argue about. The rain would answer every question soon enough. Around mid-morning, I climbed the observation point overlooking the subdivision with a pair of binoculars. Visibility had dropped as low clouds settled over the valley, turning everything soft and gray except the muddy ribbon of water pushing steadily downstream. From that elevation, I noticed something that immediately tightened every muscle in my shoulders. Water had begun collecting along several neighborhood streets instead of draining toward the creek. It was still shallow, only a few inches deep, but it was spreading wider with every passing minute. The landscape storm drains I had photographed days earlier were already struggling. Brown water circled around decorative flower beds instead of disappearing beneath them. Vehicles drove slowly through intersections, sending gentle waves across the pavement. Most residents probably assumed the drains simply needed more time. Engineers know standing water almost always means something underneath has already failed to keep pace. I called the county engineer and quietly described what I was seeing. He thanked me, said inspection crews were already moving into the area, and advised everyone to avoid unnecessary travel until rainfall slowed. As I ended the call, another deep rumble echoed across the valley. It was not thunder this time. It was the unmistakable sound of an enormous volume of water arriving from upstream, carrying with it every decision people had made over the past several years. The storm was no longer approaching. It had officially reached us. By early afternoon, the rain had become relentless. Every gutter overflowed. Every rooftop released shimmering sheets of water that disappeared into streets already struggling to keep up. From my porch, I watched the river rise against the measuring marks my grandfather had carved into an old steel post decades ago. The level climbed steadily, inch by inch, exactly within the range my engineering models had predicted. The flood wall stood silent, its damp concrete glistening beneath the gray sky, while runoff moved cleanly through the relief channels without hesitation. It was doing its job so quietly that anyone standing nearby could mistake it for doing nothing at all. Across the valley, however, the situation looked very different. My binoculars revealed water spreading farther across neighborhood intersections, collecting around decorative landscaping that had replaced natural drainage paths. Small whirlpools formed where storm drains struggled beneath layers of mulch and soaked leaves. Vehicles slowed to a crawl, creating gentle wakes that rolled toward curbs already hidden beneath muddy water. My phone buzzed repeatedly with emergency weather alerts, followed by messages from neighbors asking whether I thought the river would keep rising. I answered each one honestly. Stay inside. Avoid driving. Let emergency crews do their work. A few minutes later, another notification appeared. Melissa had started another live broadcast. This time her smile looked thinner. She insisted everything remained under control while standing near the clubhouse parking lot. Behind her, I noticed water creeping across the asphalt where there had been none less than an hour earlier. She laughed nervously and blamed clogged leaves, saying maintenance crews would handle everything once the rain slowed. She never realized thousands of viewers could see the water quietly expanding behind her with every passing minute. Then my weather station sounded a tone I had only heard during field deployments after major storms. Upstream river gauges reported a rapid surge moving toward our section of the watershed. I opened the live monitoring dashboard and watched the numbers update in real time. There it was. The crest had entered the system exactly where historical models suggested it would. I immediately called the county engineer again. He answered before the second ring. His voice remained calm, but I could hear radio traffic in the background. Inspection teams had already confirmed several block drainage structures inside the subdivision. Public works crews were being dispatched, but travel conditions were deteriorating quickly. He thanked me once more for the documentation I had sent days earlier, because it allowed them to identify the most vulnerable locations before arriving on scene. After ending the call, I walked the full length of the flood wall one final time. Rain struck my jacket with a steady hiss while muddy water pressed firmly against the protected side of the barrier before continuing safely along its designed route. Every expansion joint held. Every drainage outlet remained open. I rested one hand against the cool concrete and remembered my grandfather's quiet confidence whenever he finished a project. Good engineering never celebrates itself. It simply keeps working while everyone else argues. As I looked back toward Ashbrook Ridge, I saw flashing county vehicles entering the neighborhood through standing water that now reached well across several streets. The storm had reached the point where opinions no longer mattered. From that moment forward, every outcome would be determined by elevation, drainage, preparation, and the simple physical laws nobody had been able to vote against. Within another 20 minutes, every prediction became reality. The flood wall continued directing the swollen river exactly where it had been engineered to go, but inside Ashbrook Ridge the water followed an entirely different path. It poured across lawns that had once been natural drainage corridors, wrapped around decorative stone planters, and spread through streets that had been graded just a few inches too high in the wrong places. From my observation point, I could hear car tires hissing through standing water, emergency sirens echoing in the distance, and the constant roar of runoff rushing toward storm drains already overwhelmed by soaked mulch and scattered debris. The smell of wet soil mixed with fresh-cut grass and saturated pine drifted across the valley while the rain refused to let up. My phone vibrated nonstop. The first calls came from neighbors asking whether I knew why the streets were filling so quickly. The second wave came from county officials requesting copies of the photographs and drainage reports I had emailed earlier that week. Then I saw Melissa's live video appear one final time. Gone was the confident smile. Her umbrella leaned sideways in the wind as she turned the camera toward the clubhouse parking lot, where water had reached the lower portions of several parked vehicles. She kept repeating that nobody had expected conditions to change this fast, but the comments appearing beneath the broadcast told a different story. People were sharing screenshots of my earlier warnings, copies of county rainfall forecasts, and even photographs of the landscape storm drains I had documented before the storm arrived. Her own audience was connecting the dots in real time. Minutes later, the live stream ended without explanation. County engineers reached the neighborhood shortly afterward and immediately began inspecting drainage structures instead of my flood wall. I watched them remove heavy layers of decorative mulch, landscaping fabric, and compacted debris from several storm inlets before water finally began flowing with greater speed. One engineer looked toward my property through binoculars, then nodded quietly before speaking into his radio. The wall had never failed. It had never even come close. Everything surrounding it had. As rainfall gradually eased near sunset, the river began leveling off while runoff slowly disappeared from the streets. My property remained exactly as it had been that morning. The relief channels continued carrying water away with a steady, controlled current, leaving little more than damp concrete and scattered leaves behind. Across the subdivision, cleanup crews moved carefully from street to street, documenting drainage problems and photographing altered landscaping around public infrastructure. Before dark, I received a call from the county engineer. He thanked me again for preserving every report, photograph, and email, because those records established a clear timeline showing that concerns had been raised well before the storm arrived. After hanging up, I opened the same binder that Melissa had mocked months earlier and added one more document to the collection. A printed copy of her final email dismissing my warnings as unnecessary concern. I slid it neatly behind the inspection reports, closed the binder, and listened as the last drops of rain fell from the cottonwood branches outside. My grandfather had always believed preparation looked boring right up until the moment everyone finally understood why it mattered. The week after the storm, the sun finally returned to Ashbrook Ridge, revealing a neighborhood that looked very different from the one Melissa had proudly advertised only days before. Cleanup crews cleared debris from storm drains, survey teams measured elevations, and county engineers walked every drainage corridor with clipboards instead of assumptions. The smell of damp earth slowly faded beneath the scent of fresh lumber and newly cut grass as homeowners repaired fences, reseeded lawns, and cleared mud from sidewalks. My property required little more than routine maintenance. I rinsed silt from the drainage channels, inspected every expansion joint along the flood wall, and replaced a handful of weathered marker posts my grandfather had originally installed decades ago. The wall itself had never needed saving because it had never stopped doing its job. County officials later released their findings during a public meeting attended by far more residents than usual. Their report concluded that the flood wall had performed exactly as designed and had not contributed to the neighborhood flooding in any way. Instead, investigators identified several drainage modifications throughout the subdivision that had significantly reduced stormwater capacity, including landscaping installed around critical inlets and grading changes that redirected runoff into residential streets. Every recommendation I had submitted before the storm appeared in the final engineering summary, almost word for word. The room remained unusually quiet while those conclusions were read aloud. Nobody laughed this time. Melissa sat near the front with a folder resting unopened on the table. The confidence that had once filled every sentence she spoke had disappeared, replaced by long pauses and careful answers. Before the meeting ended, the Homeowners Association voted to withdraw every violation issued against my property. The accumulated fines were erased from their records, and a formal letter acknowledging my compliance with all county regulations arrived by certified mail 3 days later. Shortly afterward, Melissa announced her resignation as president, explaining that the community deserved new leadership moving forward. I never celebrated her departure because that had never been my goal. Winning an argument is temporary. Protecting people lasts much longer. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Neighbors I had barely spoken with before began stopping by while I worked outside. Some asked honest questions about drainage. Others wanted advice on protecting their own property before the next storm season. A few quietly admitted they had believed the stories circulating about my flood wall until they saw what actually happened with their own eyes. I answered every question the same way my grandfather would have, with patience instead of pride. On one cool autumn morning, I stood beside the wall watching clear water move gently through the channel after a light rain. The cottonwood leaves drifted across the surface before continuing downstream exactly as they always had. I rested my hand against the familiar concrete and thought about the note folded inside my grandfather's deed. For years I believed he had left me instructions about preserving a structure. I finally understood he had really been talking about preserving responsibility. Concrete eventually cracks. Steel eventually rusts. Good judgment has to be rebuilt by every generation willing to listen before nature delivers the lesson again. The river kept flowing, quiet and steady, completely indifferent to opinions, elections, meetings, or applause. In the end, it was never the loudest voice that protected the neighborhood. It was careful preparation, patient evidence, and respect for realities that could not be negotiated. That is why I still walk the wall after every storm, just as my grandfather once did, because real justice is rarely dramatic. Most of the time, it is simply the quiet reward for doing the right work long before anyone realizes why it mattered.